celebration of powers. Thanks everyone for joining. We are going to spend hour anyway. We'll see how it goes from there. But pretty informal event. First half is going to include a number of video clips from Carol Quinn, who some of you may know, but she works at Irish Distillers. She's a huge Powers fan, as well as the historian and archivist for them. So she is the go-to person for all things Powers. So I did a pretty lengthy interview with her that we will put up on the channel and website, the full length video. Tonight, I've created about 12 minutes of snippets, kind of 1 minute clips about various things that I thought were interesting about Powers, some history, some events, things like that. So we'll kind of intersperse those as we go along with the videos and kind of drinking along the way. So why don't I do this? We'll do a quick intro video with Carol, and then we'll come back and I'll kind of frame the rest of the event tonight. Have a drink.
It's what makes Powers special, what makes it unique, what makes it different to other Irish whiskies. And in doing that, I'll talk a bit about the history of Powers and how it really was the Irish whiskey that Irish people drank. It's really only fallen out of favor in the last few years. And I think it's about time that people rediscover what is a fantastic Irish whiskey. And it's certainly something that I'm extremely proud to be talking to you about today. So as you mentioned, I'm the archivist for Irish Distillers, and that means I look after our physical records. And that, in terms of Powers, are the actual ledgers, the employee records, the recipes, the mash bills, the history of making that incredible whiskey since the 1790s. So it's a wonderful thing to be able to share that history over 200 years of actually making whiskey.
Okay, so we've got various clips from Carol along the way. I wanted to kind of take a minute here. So that was just a real big picture overview, but she's kind of, again, the go-to person on everything about Powers. And what we're going to do in the first half is we'll kind of run through those clips, but we're going to, along the way, kind of introduce with those videos the three existing in the current range. So the Gold Label, the Three Swallows Pot Still, and the John's Lane. So we'll kind of have those to go. Again, it's informal, so if everybody doesn't have those with them tonight, that's fine, of course. And we'll also then, I've got some single cask and some retired Powers brands that we'll talk about the second half, and we'll kind of go through, see what people are drinking and thoughts on things. And you know, you're not muted, so it's you know, any questions you guys have along the way, just feel free. What are people drinking to start with?
I'm starting with Signature.
Okay.
Gone but not forgotten.
Yeah.
There we
Couple signatures.
Yep.
Yes.
Okay, interesting.
And I'll end with 17-year single cask from Celtic whiskey.
Ah, all right. So you're breaking out the big guns early.
It's later.
And I went the other way. I just started to just start off with the gold and ease into some of the other stuff as we go.
Yeah, I want to be at Hank's house for this tasting.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Is anybody tonight new to Powers, I guess is how I'd put it? You know, you kind of join because you want to learn about Powers, or is everybody kind of already a Powers fan?
I'm kind of new.
Yeah.
Okay,
And boy,
We only got the 12 right now.
nice.
okay. No, that's fine. That, I think, as I said up front, Powers is my favorite brand, so I'm a big fan. I think, anybody who's just getting into Irish whiskey now might not be a fan of Powers yet because they're not familiar with it, and that's partly because one of the things Carol mentioned, Powers was the #1 Irish whiskey until a few years ago. And the reason it's not now is basically a choice that was made by the marketers at Pernod Ricard when they took over. The history, so some of you may know it, but when they had to consolidate all the distilleries into one down in Middleton, they made a choice to put everything behind Jameson. So Powers continued to be the #1 Irish whiskey, but globally Jameson was where they put all their efforts into. And that's why here in America, very little went into it until really, that's why I'm kind of excited about the new ad campaign they just started in the last few weeks. But very little money went into it. A lot of stores didn't carry the brand here. But people who started drinking Irish whiskey maybe 15 years ago, when there were only 4 distilleries, that's kind of how I think I got into Powers, because at the time that was one of the only things around. You had Jameson, Powers, Bushmills, and Powers was very unique compared to those. So it was easy to kind of become a Powers fan if you started drinking before the explosion of all the distilleries. But if you're new to the game, we'll make you into Powers fans by the end of the night. The more the merrier. Actually, we need more Powers fans so they keep the brand going and keep putting money into it.
Absolutely.
Alan, what was it that got you started or hooked, or where was your first experience with it?
With Powers?
Yeah.
I don't have a great, like a seminal moment like that was when I, but when you first started on the first couple trips over, there wasn't a lot to choose from. So when you went into the pubs in Ireland, that was in every bar. So it was kind of easy to drink that. You either got that or a couple other things, and if you were splurging at the time, you might get Redbreast.
Okay.
And you got to remember too, this would have been like there was Powers Gold, and that was it. And then there was a Powers 12 that has since been retired, but there was no John's Lane, there was no Three Swallows, there was just the regular Gold. But once we got the society kicked off in 2010, we used to have to try to come up with unique ways to do tasting events. So one of the early ones, some of you may remember, is we did the Battle of the Johns, which was just side by side kind of comparison. We did Jameson versus Powers Gold. We did the 12 years against each other. That kind of, because we were at the time, you had very little inventory, so you were looking for unique ways to come up with interesting tasting events. But I will say, this is the one thing I remember. I remember designing that tasting event and thinking at the time that everybody coming into it was a Jameson fan. And Kathy, you were there, I believe. So you might remember this. At the end of that 6 whiskey lineup, kind of side by side going through it. And when we took the vote at the end, we had converted a bunch of Jameson drinkers, and Powers actually won the night.
Nice. Awesome.
So I think that it's a little bit about exposure. It's a great whiskey. And as you will hear in some of these clips, I'll stop talking here in a second. You kind of come away with realizing that, if you do the big 3, Bushmills, Jameson, Powers, that are around now, Powers has the most, you could say, history behind it, and kind of cool, unique stories and stuff that are in the archives compared to the other 2 that we know about. But let me, so let's do
Alan,
this. Let's,
Sorry, just before you jump on, one other quick question.
Yeah.
You know, and I recall, you know, you mentioned going to, when you were doing trips to Ireland and there was only a certain number of whiskies on the shelf. I remember that growing up, there was the same brands that you just mentioned. They were the only ones that were there. Has the style changed in any way in the 15, 20 years that you've been drinking it?
well, you certainly had the explosion of, you know, well, a pot still, you know, so I would argue when we first started, the only pot, you had Green Spot and Redbreast, and the only place you could get Green Spot was at Mitchell and Sons in Dublin. You know, so you could maybe it would probably be interesting to do a timeline sometime. You could literally trace, you know, like what happened 2009, you know, like 2010, 11, then you had Dingle come along as the first new distillery. 2012, I want to say, is when Powers John's Lane was released. That was a huge event because, you know, because that was, and that blew everyone away because that was a new pot still, you know, so you had Redbreast and Green Spot, and then boom, they came out with John's Lane, and that was like, wow. And then, you know, then after that, they came out with Yellow Spot and some of the other things, but like, so each year, and then some of the new distilleries came on. So it's changed dramatically in the last, you know, 10 to 15 years. But one of the big first things to happen was the release of John's Lane. And that was the first new pot still, really. And then I think, I don't know what happened from there, but, you know, in terms of what, because it seemed to have a lot of momentum. And then the last couple of years, they just stopped kind of putting marketing dollars behind it. But they've got a new distributor now. And it looks like it's making kind of a comeback in terms of the, you know, the money that they're putting behind it. So that's great. And that's one of the things that Carol actually talks about at the end of the interview.
And this is the original design for the Powers Gold label bottle. But, you know, times change, tastes change, and things move on. Originally, Powers was always a pot still whiskey. Now that's the signature style of Irish whiskey. It's been around since 1785, and it's a mixture of malted and unmalted barley distilled in copper pot stills. And that's the signature style of Irish whiskey. And that's when Powers was on its heyday. That's the whiskey it was. But times change and tastes changed. And by the time you got into the 1950s and the 1960s, the world wanted a different flavor profile. There was a huge interest in lighter blended whiskies that were more approachable. A lot of people were put off by the strength, the mouthfeel of pot still, and it was time for a change. So the Venerable Powers in 1967, it changed from being a pot still to a blended whiskey. So the Powers Gold label that you see today is a blended whiskey. That means it's a mixture of pot still and grain whiskey, whereas the traditional Powers was purely pot still. But never fear, we haven't abandoned the lovers of pot still. And within the Powers range, the John's Lane whiskey is a pot still made in the traditional way. And it is the closest we can come to today to the traditional taste of Powers.
So the gold label, which is the current blend, one of the things that's kind of cool and why, you know, I would contend arguably one of the top 3 blends out there for Irish whiskey is the Powers Gold label. I don't know. So this is the current version, which has the iconic red pea. It's also got the reference to 3 swallows. That we're going to talk a little bit about the redesign in the last couple of years later on, the squat bottle, but you know, they've gone through a couple redesigns. I mentioned how John's Lane came out in 2012, I think it was, and how big an event that was when that happened. When they did that, they kind of redesigned the labels. But, you know, they kind of did it into this version at the time. This was another earlier version, you know, back in the early 2000s. Is anyone drinking Gold Label right now?
I am.
You are? So does anyone, I'm just curious because I still have I haven't opened this bottle yet. So one of the other things they've done along the way over the last 10 years, when they did the John's Lane release, they upped the ABV of the Gold Label. So this is a 40% Powers Gold Label, which is what you used to get. And then, you know, and you can see it's got the 3 swallows, but it's 40%. And then when they did the redesign, they upped it to 43.
Yes.
So now it's 43, but that was one of the other changes along the way. So, you know, if you were to come across an old bottle of Gold Label, you might still see, because again, that's another thing, Andrew, you asked kind of questions about things that have changed. Back 10 years ago, cask strength was not something that existed, you know, with Irish whiskey. Everything was 40%. And then you slowly had some higher ABVs. But the popularity of, you know, the higher strength stuff really took off in the last, you know, 5-6 years, arguably.
Yeah, I found a 12-year in Germany somewhere and it's 40%.
The old Special Reserve 12 year. Yeah, that was again, so back in like 2010, that would have been considered the premium type of, you know, of Irish whiskey at the time, that and Redbreast, because you had Jameson 12. So it was that when that went away, they retired that. I remember that being disappointed and then they quickly came out with John's Lane and everyone kind of got over
got over it.
Got over it quickly.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was in Wexford and a bartender there swears by this one, and then I went searching for it when she pulled it out for me afterwards.
I actually had a glass of it over the weekend in Dublin. I was in a pub that had it. And so I said, oh, you know what, give me a pour of that. I haven't had that in a while. So, but the difference with that old one is that was a 12-year blend. Whereas when they came out with the John's Lane, that was a single pot still. So with the Gold Label, as I was kind of mentioning, so the other thing that kind of makes this stand out, we were talking about the ABV, but why this is such a good blend. Most blends that you see out there are 60 to 70% grain, you know, and or I should say they're a 70 to 80% grain, really. So you have like a 20 to 30% single malt component in most blends. And then you have some that are a combination of all 3 styles of Irish whiskey, which would be pot still, single malt, and single grain. Like, so Paddy's a good example of that. But what makes Powers Gold so good is this is a blend of single pot still and grain, and it's a very high, it's like 70% pot still. So you're getting the opposite as opposed to, you know, blends that are mostly grain. This is very high pot still component and a small grain component. And you get that classic kind of Powers spice, you know, very, you know, as opposed to say Jameson, which I would argue has a sweeter profile, more sherry component. So it kind of just depends on what your taste palates are into. But you know, that's why I think a lot of people kind of go towards Powers too, especially maybe if you're an American bourbon drinker. It's a similar kind of vanilla and spice profile in some cases. So it's kind of a nice, easy way to kind of segue into it.
What you just said there, Alan, it implies that this is fantastic value for the money.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
100%.
I would, yeah, I mean, Powers Gold, you can't go wrong. I mean, it's not top shelf, you know, literally when you're talking shelves in a bar and stuff, but I would argue you can't go wrong. Go into a pub, and if you're, you know, ordering a Guinness, this is one of the next best companions to it. I think one of the reviews I think I wrote on the website years ago is, you know, I call it just the peanut butter and jelly. You know, they just go together. Powers Gold and Guinness.
Great combo.
Yeah, so but yeah, it's a great value. It's a great everyday, you know, drinker.
Yep.
And that's why everybody, I think, in Ireland had a bottle of it, you know, in their house for years. And again, it was only until, you know, I don't know the exact year, but it's, you know, as of even like 2012, when John's Lane came out, I think Powers was technically still the #1 selling whiskey in Ireland. And then at some point over the last few years, Jameson overtook it. And that, you know, again, they decided to put everything behind Jameson, and it's paid off because it's lifting up the whole category. But I think what's happened to Powers is that because they put so much into Jameson, you've got the new generation of drinkers, particularly here in America. And Jameson is the Irish whiskey they know when they go to the pubs. They don't know what Powers is. So, you know, so arguably Powers fans are probably a little bit skewed older. Kind of, I guess, makes sense because that new ad campaign, anyone that's seen it, they're really emphasizing how it's old and stuff. So that's kind of an interesting way to go. But, you know, it's like anything else. Once you get people kind of to try something, you know, then I think they'll, because it is such a good whiskey. So at some point, people will get tired of doing shots of Jameson probably. And but you got
that's kind of the difference, right? You shoot Jameson, you shoot Tullamore Dew, and as you mature a little bit, you drink a Powers. That'd be a great way for them to position it.
100%.
Yeah.
And then I also think they should do a lot more like taste. I mean, they're kind of competing against themselves, but like have people have a John's Lane side by side with a Redbreast 12.
Yep. Yeah, and even though they're both pot stills made by Middleton, they're very far, you know, on the spectrum of taste profiles. You know, they're both excellent, but it's amazing how different they are, you know, from different casks and different cuts and stuff. So
in some ways, Alan, there's a case to be made for Powers to be a base for cocktails with being made with Irish whiskey, because it's not an expensive price, and that spice character, it actually has, frankly, it's got more character than Jameson. And I'm no mixology expert, but you know, they look for a base spirit that's got some additional flavor to it, and this definitely has.
yeah, and for cocktails, it's got a higher ABV too, because Jameson's still 40%.
Yeah.
So that's going to get kind of overwhelmed in a lot of cocktails as well.
The gold label, I'm sorry, the gold label is very versatile. I love it neat, obviously, but man, it makes a great Irish. You can put it in Irish coffee. It makes a great old fashioned. You can drink it with a little ginger beer. It's very versatile, and that's what I love about the gold label.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a good segue, Matt. Thanks. So let's do this. Let's hear about the gold label and why, you know, because I refer to it as that. So someone might be saying, well, why do they call it gold label? So
even though it's red.
Yeah, the current iteration is red, but
they had the best equipment at their distillery, and they wanted to communicate that to the consumer. So when they began bottling to export, well, of course, you needed a label. In the early days, you just had the oak barrel with the P emblazoned on it, branded, but you needed a label. So when they came to design it, they designed what became known as the iconic gold label for Powers. And as I explained, this gold color was the most expensive ink you could buy. It's not actually ink, it's metal. It's ground particles of bronze. So their entire label was in this metallic gold. Now you can't quite see it here, but if you were looking at this in daylight, you know, back at the archive, it shines, it glitters, it absolutely gleams. It jumps off the shelf to you. And they never changed it because it said what they needed it to say, that this is something very, very special.
So we talked today about how this is a great value whiskey. But at the time when this was out, this was a high-end whiskey. It was the premium whiskey in Dublin at the time. And that's what the gold was about. It was actually very expensive and most people couldn't afford it. So kind of, so you come, a couple hundred years later and, it's probably arguably it's more considered like the everyman's Irish whiskey now. But back then that's kind of where it fit in society, it was all the royalty, and it was, I think if you have time at some point to watch the whole video that we'll put out there, the interview with Carol, she goes into a ton of history, but they've got archives of things showing all the exporting of powers they did globally. And it's amazing all the countries that they shipped powers to. And the who's who of who was ordering it, and they've got the invoices and orders and records and ledgers. It's pretty interesting if you like that kind of history stuff. But yeah, it was really kind of the the whiskey of the time. And the other part of the gold label, that she mentioned was the P brand. So we can take a look at that as well.
And as I go through the archive, one of the things that stands out for me is the absolute pride. The pride of the people working there, the pride of the family, the Powers family, and their pride in Ireland and Irishness. And one of the ways that this comes through to me was I found one day this item. It's a cigarette box. And when I opened it up, I found these lovely emblems. Beautiful red silk with the diamond P in brass on them. And whenever members of John's Lane were taking part in things like a Patrick's Day parade or another civic event, they would pin these diamond Ps onto them to show that they were from Powers and to show how proud they were of that. And today in a lot of our advertising, we use the diamond P, and it comes directly from this find from the archives that dates back to about the 1890s. And that's the whole thing about Powers. It has such an incredible history, and it's so rich that in the marketing that all we're really trying to do is share some of that incredible history.
So at the time when the P first started, it was used to put on the barrels, because back when it first started, they didn't actually bottle whiskey. So they put the P on the barrels, so you knew it was Powers. So that's how it actually started. But that's a little bit of the history of where the gold label started and where the P, it goes all the way back to the beginning. So the gold's gone through different iterations. We talked a little bit about the 12-year that has come out, and now since been retired. So what they did a few years ago was they had a whole kind of relaunch. They rebranded, and that's when they launched the John's Lane. And then that was so successful and such a big deal when, over the next few years when it came out, they decided to expand the range further. And that's when they came out with the Signature, and the Three Swallows. So what they basically did is they kept the gold label and they expanded the pot still range. So you had the 12-year age statement John's Lane, and they introduced two younger versions of the pot still to kind of with a lower price point as well, to expand, really take advantage of the increasing repopularity of single pot still. So the next one that I want to talk about is the Three Swallows. So Three Swallows is, comes in that color tube. So the way you differentiate them now is more or less by color. So you got the red, iconic red for the gold label. The Three Swallows is in this light blue. It also has more prominently the Three Swallows on it. And this is what you'd call the entry level single pot still. So it's, very similar in style and cask finishing and everything to John's Lane and to Signature at the time. It was really just kind of an age statement, primarily difference, and then a price point. This one is at 43.2% as well. Is anyone drinking Three Swallows tonight at all, or have one?
I am.
So I'm gonna pour one of these. And so when so one of the things, you've got really kind of the brand and the labeling with Powers has a lot of history. So we, just heard a little bit about the gold label. We heard about the P branding. The other big thing is the Three Swallows. And there's a lot of stories about, why do they call it Three Swallows? So Carol, what goes into this? So we'll listen.
One of the questions that I'm often asked is the iconic Three Swallow emblem that you find on a bottle of Powers. And of course, we have now part of the range is known as Three Swallow. Where did that come from? And I was very cocky about this when I first started my job. And I said very confidently at an interview, nobody knows, it's lost in history. And I'd no sooner than we got a phone call from a woman called Olivia O'Reilly who said, I know. And her father was a direct descendant of James Power. And indeed, he was the last managing director of the Powers Distillery. And the Three Swallow, it originated as an age statement. You needed something in an era of not universal adult literacy. There's no point writing, this is a 3-year-old whiskey, if people can't read that. And you need a visual clue. So the Swallows were that visual clue. And the standard whiskey, up until the age of whiskey, up until the 20th century, is the 7-year-old whiskey. So the Three Swallow, if you saw that on a label, it meant it was a 7-year-old whiskey. But why swallows? Some people use stars, some people use dots, many, many different things. And the story that Olivia O'Reilly was told by her father, who got it from his father and all the generations before him, was that the Powers family were extremely proud of the horses in the distillery. And they stabled their own family horses in the distillery. Their own family coach would have been stored there. And it was the groomsmen who worked in the distillery drove the Powers family through the streets of Dublin. Now, the Powers family would have been very well thought of. They were very successful and they would have been part of Dublin's elite. So they're going to gala occasions like balls in Dublin Castle, and they would go in the coach. And in the coach, you had 3 coachmen. You had a driver, his assistant, and at the back, to balance the coach when people came in and out, you had a 3rd coachman. And while the Powers family would go into whatever glittering occasion they were going to, the 3 coachmen would stay outside. And there's no use working for a distillery unless you've got a few perks of the job. And they would have had a little flask, not enough whiskey to get them drunk, but just enough to keep the cold out. and there was enough in there for one swallow for each man. So when the time came to come up with a visual identifier for an age statement, they took the emblem of the 3 swallow as a tribute to the coachman who would drive the family through the streets of Dublin.
Had anyone heard that story before?
No, that's interesting.
Yeah.
That was a great story. I'd never heard it.
Yeah. So I'd heard different things along the way, kind of, if you buy a bottle, you're supposed to drink it in 3 gulps or stuff like that. You heard stuff like that along the way. So, tall tales. But so, the 3 swallow is a big part of the history legacy of the brand. And then when they did this latest expansion of the pot still range, they decided to actually call one of the the youngest offering 3 swallows. So but it goes beyond just the one non-age statement pot still that they have, because if you look back at any of the bottles, like, so here's just the gold label. I don't know if people can see it, but in Boston, the glass are actually the swallows. So a lot of the stuff you have, if you look closely, you'll find the 3 swallows somewhere, either in print or in the glass, or so it's that's that, the P and the gold label, those are all just like kind of the signature things about Powers. And which is why we'll talk about the rebranding that they did about 2 years ago, which I guess you could say was a little controversial. And we'll table that till we get there, because I am curious to like which version of labels that people like, but we'll table that for a few minutes.
Hey, Alan, can I ask a question from your
Sure.
conversations with them? 3 swallows seems like a great way to introduce people to pot still. It's low price. It's awesome. It seems like something Irish Distillers could be pushing to really bring that style to everyone. Are there any plans for that from what you've heard?
Yes. Well, let me just say this. Yes, there's plans to better promote and get behind the Powers brand. I wouldn't necessarily say 3 swallows specifically.
Okay.
But I would think, it's not like they've got 7 or 8 different ones. So, but because I think what they did is obviously Jameson got most of the attention, and then I would argue Redbreast got kind of the whole campaign behind it, because that was already the leader in the clubhouse as far as pot stills. So Powers kind of always got left a little bit behind. But I'm encouraged now, because they did switch distributors a year or so ago. They got their own distributor. So even though they're still made at Middleton, they kind of, I don't exactly know how it's set up, but they have somebody who's just looking after that brand. So it's not like they're walking into stores and they have to compete with Redbreast and Middleton and some other stuff, so they can focus just on that.
Because they're almost 4th or 5th, right? I mean, Green Spot range is cool. Method and Madness is super cool, and Powers is sort of ignored, except for the people that really know it. People that know it love it.
And it seems though that with this new ad campaign, if people have seen it, that they're kind of almost embracing the old, because why try to be cool and new, because you've got the Method and Madness for that.
Yep.
And the Spots had such a cult thing going, because until very recently you couldn't get Green Spot here, so the only way you could get it was to go to Dublin. And then then they brought it here, so that took a little mystery away, and they've expanded the range greatly. But yeah, so I think they've kind of it seems like they've tried to carve out, okay, where does Powers fit? It's a historic brand. It used to be the #1 Irish whiskey. So let's embrace all that and go back to, so maybe that's what they're going to do with it. and we'll see. I'm hopeful. I don't need it to become the super cool, everybody loves it. I just
No.
because I kind of like, knowing it's great and it's not, everybody like, but I don't want it to be ignored either.
Right.
So,
I think that's a good strategy. And so,
yeah.
Everything's marketing.
Yeah.
right.
Well, we've seen that with some other brands that won't be named tonight. Probably all know.
Alan, is there a, it's interesting the comparison with Jameson, and we all know that Jameson is the brand that saved Irish whiskey, going back to the dark days. I haven't tried it yet. I'm not sure if you tried any when you were in Dublin last week, but obviously the new release of the Jameson single pot still is, I suppose, going to be going head to head with this one in terms of price.
Yeah, I'm trying to think price point. Actually,
It's higher.
it's not here
Okay.
yet, but the Jameson pot still is a higher cost than.
It's closer to John's Lane.
Yeah, no,
Okay.
exactly. And
Okay.
I don't know if they're doing that because they can, because it's got the Jameson name on it, but it's a multi-cask finish, so they're probably trying to recoup some of that. I did have some in Dublin over the weekend, and it was good. It didn't blow me away, but I don't want to make judgment on an initial sample. I did buy a bottle in duty free and bring it home. I haven't had it yet this week, but my initial reaction was it was good. And I hadn't had a regular Jameson in a while, to be honest with you, but I was kind of like, I wasn't getting a huge difference with regular Jameson. It kind of had, but I want to reserve judgment and open up the bottle and sit with it. And because I think I've talked with some people about this, I wish it hadn't come out in a way, given the powers.
Yep.
They're trying to get, because it's going to kind of pull people away from powers. Because I think it's going to be the gateway whiskey into single pot still for people who haven't found Redbreast yet, or don't want to, because if you're already a big Jameson lover, well, I'll try the new Jameson. And then it'll be, single pot still's good. What other single pot stills? And then they'll find Redbreast and Green Spot and, that kind of thing. So I think it'll end up being a big success. The price point's interesting, though, because I would have thought they would have tried to come in at a little bit lower price point on it.
About, what is it, about low mid 60s, you think?
Yeah.
I haven't seen it here yet.
Yeah, that's where it's at.
It isn't here yet, right? So it's
No.
hard to say exactly, but I think
It was 60 euro on the launch. 60
Yeah.
euro on the launch.
Yeah, that's what it was in duty free too. So little pricey, arguably.
I
Given
think James Fox carries it, and I just told him not to include it in my latest order.
yeah, I didn't. I was there. I didn't get it from them mainly because I knew I could get it in duty free, and I didn't have any more room or weight allowance in my suitcase. So I was getting other things that I knew I couldn't get at duty free. It's all strategy when you're traveling.
Absolutely.
But
Brian, you liked it. What was your take on it?
So what's my take? I think first of all, it's so it is a single pot still, but it's like a 5 cask influence, but it's a heavy sherry influence. So, if you like Powers John's Lane, if you like Redbreast 12, you're going to be, I think you're going to really, really like it. But I don't know, Alan, I'm a little surprised you didn't, knowing things that you do like, but
I didn't like it. I wasn't blown away. Like,
okay, fair enough.
Because you know what, the sherry component of it was there, and that's where I was like, oh, it's not, so it had a big sherry influence, I guess, which reminded me of regular Jameson. And, again, I never really, I always reserve judgment. I always try to drink a whiskey at least twice. Because
that's a good policy.
Yeah, what you ate. I think I was at Beau's bar in Dublin when I got it. I can't remember what I'd you know, at what point in the night it was, that kind, you know, if it was
You
whiskey.
hadn't eaten anything. If you were in both.
I don't know if it was
Maybe
whiskey
some
one,
crisps.
it was whiskey 1 or whiskey 4, you know, so it's just, you never, when we do tasting lineups, I always tell people to go back and retry whiskey number 1, because sometimes it gets an unfair, you know, review, because it's the first one to hit people's tongues, so.
Right. And then by the time you get to 6, your palate's just fried, so you can't taste anything.
Correct. Yep. So, but you know, somebody's got to be first and somebody's got to be last.
Right. Right.
But so yeah, so I'm looking forward to opening the bottle I brought. You know, so it wasn't like I didn't like it because I bought a bottle and brought it back.
Yeah.
And I, you know, it's one of those I want to sit with one night and you know, try to make a better assessment than
Yeah.
just having a pour in a bar.
I think your take is right, though. It's definitely a strong sherry influence on the flavor profile on it. So you better like your sherry influence stuff. So
well, that'll be popular, right? Because there's a lot of, you know, I would argue half the stuff out there. You know, there's been a lot of new wine finish stuff. You know, Peeling's kind of led the charge on that, but sherry dominates in the sense of finish. So it's probably smart, right? You kind of trying to get people into single pot still, and you do a sherry finish, which people generally like. So it is a fairly big leap up, though. You know, I would have thought they want to play off the Jameson popularity, but you know, where you can get that bottle for $25, you're going to pay more than double to buy the pot still. So I'm curious to see how well it does, if people are ready to make that jump.
Yeah. I just wonder if it wasn't an attempt to fill like that mid price point, right? Because you've got Black Barrel in the 30 to 35, you got Green Bottle at the budget level, and then the next thing up, really, at least that we have over here, is the 18, right? I mean, there isn't much else in between.
Lineup, you're right. Yeah, so because Black Barrel's arguably the one that's been just taking off the last couple of years and dominating sales. So they probably don't want to cannibalize that, but it is basically priced at the same level as Redbreast 12. So they're going to, you know, they're going to potentially, you know, I don't know if they'll cannibalize Redbreast, but it's just that from a price point, it's basically where John's Lane and Redbreast 12 are. So it'll be
agreed
to see how it, you know, where it all shakes out.
Certainly Jameson Orange isn't going to cannibalize any of it. So
don't mention that.
I have not had I have not tried it, and it's not high on my list, but no fan.
So I will say I've tried it, and that's because my 25, 26-year-old daughter bought a bottle of it because she wanted to try it. And if you remember the old like McDonald's orange drink, High C, that's pretty much the flavor profile.
Yes.
Nice.
So
spot on. Yeah, that's spot on. Yep. It's not good.
All right, let's
just before we jump ahead, Alan,
Sure.
sorry for leading us off on a Jameson tangent, but I'll be interested to see if because one of the interesting parts about people's journey into pot still is the little 4-pack that they offer. Irish Distillers do that 4-pack, and it's always struck me as very odd that the 4th bottle in there is Middleton Barry Crockett, which is a very expensive bottle to buy on its own. If you're to try and replicate this tasting. So I wonder, will they take that out and put the Jameson pot still in there, and then you'd have Redbreast, Green Spot, Harris, John Lane, and the Jameson.
Possibly, yeah. I think at the time, you know, because obviously they've expanded the range, but at the time they were showing kind of they have like a flavor profile chart, because they're all cutting it from the same pot still base and then different cuts and different casks and stuff to come up with the Barry Crockett extremely different from, you know, Powers John Lane or Redbreast. You know, so it's just interesting how they can kind of come up with such distinct flavor profiles, kind of with similar distillate, and just how they, you know, how they're able to cut it and age it. But all right, well, let's move on a little bit. So we've done 2 of the whiskeys so far. We'll do the John's Lane in a moment, but I thought a couple of other cool things about Powers brand over the years that some of you may be aware of, but I thought it was worth hearing Carol talk about a couple things. So one of them is from the World Fair, so I can kind of tease it a little bit. She's going to get into it, but at the time, you know, so again, back in the heyday of Irish whiskey, Powers was the king, and it was a global brand. I mentioned earlier how they were exporting around the world to all these countries, and America, you know, was the biggie, obviously, and the world fairs at the time were the showcase event for everything. And so Powers came to the World Fair in Chicago in 1893, and they wanted to make a big splash. So Carol's going to talk about that. I actually was doing a little research on it, that it's amazing some of the things that were introduced and basically invented at the World Fair in Chicago in 1893. I don't know if any of you are historians and stuff, but it's kind of interesting. But I'll let her.
So this is
tell
a
you.
souvenir program from the 1893 World's Fair in Chicago, and Powers were exhibiting there, and they produced this lovely little program. And there's no sense rocking up to a World's Fair and, you know, with your drink and just saying, oh, have a glass of that. You have to create a showstopper. You have to do something that is going to make people pay attention to you. And Powers did that. And what you see in the middle here, they created what was known as the Powers Round Tower. Now, the Round Tower, for anyone who's been to Ireland, you'll know this. It's a feature of the Irish landscape. And it's usually part of medieval monasteries, and they're usually bell towers. But there's something that every Irish child associates with the Irish landscape. So when Powers wanted to create a display, it was the Round Tower that they went for. And if you look here, this is an adult male wearing a top hat. The tower was over 33 feet tall. And there's 23 tiers. Each one is made up of bottles of gold label. And we estimate that it's over 700 bottles of gold label whiskey.
So just kind of a little cool historical thing with Powers. I know no one actually was at the World's Fair. I don't think any of you were 100 years old, but so I think I teased, if you saw some of the promos we were doing ahead of this, I was saying that I'm going to give Powers credit for inventing the game Jenga.
I get it now.
But so yeah, so they really, you know, made a splash, and you know, but they were the brand at the time. You know, and I think, again, if you have time someday or looking to kill time and watch the whole video, which is about 45 minutes long, she goes into the distillery and the working conditions and how they were kind of the preeminent family in Dublin, and how well they treated all their workers, and how they really implemented a lot of things that still are around today, as far as how to treat employees, how to, you know, they gave them lodging, just a lot of kind of interesting stories and stuff. They actually, in the distillery, it was a flat roof, and I think you can see this on the website. Actually, they let the employees basically use the flat roof to plant crops, and they grew crops on top of the distillery. So just a lot of, you know, interesting things along the way as they were coming along. But the other thing from a historical perspective that I think is interesting that people probably are not aware of, because again, the Powers doesn't get a lot of marketing push, but pretty much if you're from New England, you know, we call them nips, or, you know, people refer to them as miniatures, but I'll let Carol.
And there were so many things that were unique and different about Powers. And one of the things that not a lot of people realize is that they invented the miniature, the actual miniature bottle. They were the first spirit company in the world to bottle a miniature, and it became known as the Baby Power. And it was 1889 when this was first produced. And a lot of people ask me, you know, well, why? And I really think it's because they were so egalitarian and they wanted everyone to have access to their whiskey. And as I mentioned, Powers Gold Label was very, very expensive, and it really wasn't within the reach of the working man. But he's entitled to it. Why shouldn't he drink this wonderful whiskey? So they produced the Baby Power because that was economically more available. The same top quality, the same premium whiskey, but affordable. And they were the first spirit company in the world. So anytime you might be out fishing, you might be out traveling, and you treat yourself to a little miniature, you should say, thank you, Powers. And at the time, back in the late 1880s, when this bottle was first produced, whiskey was bottled very like bottles of wine are today. You had a driven cork covered in a lead capsule, and you opened it with a corkscrew. And of course, for the Baby Power being so small, the normal corkscrew was just too big. So this was an issue. But of course, Powers thought of everything. They went back to the engineering workshop, and the engineers produced this lovely little thing. Each bottle came with its own corkscrew, so you could open it yourself. I mean, really, talk about thinking of the whole package.
So I have a Baby Powers here, doesn't have the corkscrew though. If you find one of those, hang on to it, or, you know, probably could sell it at one of the auction houses. But yeah, I don't. Was anyone aware that you can credit Powers with inventing the mini?
No idea.
And that I did, yeah. So that's a pretty cool story, and that's why you'll see if you look at any old advertising signs, a lot of in the pubs in Ireland, you know, tons of Powers mirrors. Almost like it's probably a rule if you're a pub in Ireland, you have to have a Powers mirror. But you'll see references to ad campaigns and things from back in the day called Baby Powers, and that's the reference to it. But
That's super cool.
all right, so let's kind of talk, you know, again, informal, but let's talk about the third whiskey in the current core range, and that's, you know, we've talked a little bit about it already, but that's the John's Lane, which, as I mentioned earlier, came out in, I think it was 2012, if I'm remembering correctly. And it was when it came out in the new branding. So you can see this was, you know, they changed and they went to this kind of, they were all the same at the time. They changed the gold label too, came out with this. But anyway, so the John's Lane was a big, you know, if you're doing like a history of Irish whiskey the last quarter century, I would argue this would be on the documentary, because again, it was the first kind of new pot still that came out with, we had Green Spot, which again at the time kind of coincided with when Green Spot came to America. Within a year or so, I would say. I'd have to go back and look at my own kind of notes and stuff when Green Spot first came here, but it was pretty close to when John's Lane came out. So you had really, for a while, Redbreast was the only game in town here in America. And then suddenly you had John's Lane, which was a huge hit. And then Green Spot came, and then, you know, things really started to take off, and Yellow Spot followed, things like that. But this is the other thing that was little bit different. So this was a full single pot still, was also 46% ABV. And again, at the time, the gold label was only 40, and then they since upped it to 43. So this was a step up in ABV, and really kind of what was unique about this too is, with Redbreast, you had the big sherry component, the Christmas cake quality, and with Green Spot, you had kind of that spice kick with the orchard fruits and the apple, with Green Spot. So this was a real departure from those two, leathery, vanilla, spice, just kind of the classic powers really ramped up. And it was a big, huge hit when it came out. So this was the original version. And then, the rebrand that they've done is consistent with the other two that we've seen. So the coloring is what makes it different other than the name, and it's got the gray coloring. Still 12 years, still at the 46%. Is anybody drinking this or have this?
Yeah, me.
Yes, indeed.
I get it.
And Andrew, you were, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, are you trying it for the first time right now, or did you try it like very recently?
So this is, I opened the bottle. I've been working my way through these over the last week and a half in preparation for tonight.
Training's tough, huh?
Yeah, someone's got to do it. So
I'm embarrassed you're part of this and you haven't had John's Lanes before. That's like a horrible thing to hear.
I got hooked on this journey by Redbreast. So, guilty as charged on that front. But I have to say, when I tried this for the first time last week, I was completely taken by it. It is, yeah, and we talked about alcohols tonight. This is weighing in at 46%. I just had a peek at regular Green Spot and regular Redbreast, and they're at 40.
Mm-hmm.
That little bit of extra alcohol just adds so much character to it.
Yeah, Redbreast is, I think for a long time, that's what everybody's go-to. If they said, what Irish whiskey should I drink? And then this came along and certainly was a rival, particularly here, where you could tell people, oh yeah, get the John's Lane. And the price point was very reasonable too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Hank, to your point about, access to this, I've been buying Redbreast, not anymore, but back in 16, 17, 18, was able to get it at Costco here in Northern California for $35 a bottle.
Wow.
And when it was on promotion, it was $28 a bottle. So, that's when we would buy 2 and 3 at a time. And so I've kind of been spoiled by that. So now having to pay, the proper fair retail price for a single pot still, which obviously, starts at 51, 52, 53 bucks for the 3 swallows. And this one was in the mid 60s, which is where Redbreast is today.
Yeah.
So
Do they still sell it in Costco? Because that's like the reason why you don't go to Costco and Total Wine.
Wow.
yeah. No,
Oh my God,
Redbreast there.
they kill your margin. Oh my God.
Yeah,
Well, I remember when you could get Redbreast back in like 2012 timeframe was probably when it changed. You could get Redbreast for $39.
Wow.
So 10 years ago. And I remember when the rumor came out that they were going to ramp up the price, because that's when pot still started becoming really, Green Spot came, John's Lane came out, and it took off. And the rumor was Redbreast is going up, and it kind of jumped to 50 pretty quickly. But
yes, it's in some ways it's kind of a means to an end. When you get a listing at Costco, you're able to shift volume,
right?
And that's what got me hooked on Redbreast, and I continue to buy it at our Whole Foods here in town. Bizarrely enough, sells it for 53 a bottle, whereas everyone else sells it for 65. So Alan and I have talked about it a few times. You've got to be aware of pricing because it is all over the place. Literally, geographically as well as even in your local market.
Don't move to North Carolina where you can't buy anything worth a damn unless you buy from Ireland.
Yeah, I was gonna say Pete and Stephen, thank you. So
Oh gosh.
with one of the other things, and I'll show you a video about is when it came out in this box. So it was kind of this, I don't know, what do we want to call this, maroon color? But what was cool, in addition to, the bottling was cool, kind of has you can see that, the iconic P on the front top label, but in each box that have this version was this brochure, pamphlet, whatever we want to call it, but it's an excerpt from the Alfred Barnard's book at the time when he did the core and review of all the distilleries from a couple hundred years ago. And it's a whole thing about the John's Lane distillery, which is why this is referred to as John's Lane, because the distillery itself was located on John's Lane.
So Alan, the one thing you got to tell them is that they're going after the older crowd. That is almost impossible to read as an older human being.
Yeah, well, it's kind of like Ulysses too, right? Right? Anyone ever sit through and get through that whole thing without drinking,
Right.
Irish whiskey too? But when I know we'll talk about the rebranding in a minute, but when they rebranded, I know the biggest thing that people talked about with this was, well, what do you do? What about because everybody loved this and the fact that you got that pamphlet brochure in with whiskey, and you didn't get it with the rebrand. So if you still have any of these, you hold on to that because it's kind of a piece of history along the way. If you kind of like that kind of thing. But let me play. I think we've got 2 more clips. But Carol talks about the distillery and John's Lane, which is interesting. Some of you may have actually been to it.
Now, from what was very humble beginnings, John's Lane, the site of the distillery, grew. This is an image from the 1880s, and you can see the vast scale of the distillery. It stretched over 5 acres of Dublin city centre. It was almost a self-sufficient town within the city of Dublin, and it had everything within its walls to make Powers whiskey. When we look at this, we might think, oh, that's an interesting kind of Victorian design. But to contemporary eyes, this was a shining beacon of modernity. It was like going to Silicon Valley today. Hopefully, some of you will be able to come to Dublin. You will be able to visit it. And the frontier is called Thomas Street. And you can walk up Thomas Street and you can actually go in this arch. It is now the campus of the NCAD, the National College of Art and Design in Dublin. And you can actually walk down the very cobblestones, the same cobblestones that generations of distillers walked on in Dublin. And it's a really, really special experience. And I'd encourage anybody who is going to be able to visit Dublin to do that.
Has anybody been there to do that besides me?
Me.
Kathy, you were with me one time.
Yep.
So a couple things on that, the kind of rebirth of Irish whiskey. So the first time I went to go check out the stills that are still sitting there exposed, to the elements within the college there in the campus area, I made the mistake, and I wrote about this, it's on the website from my John's Lane review from years ago, but I made the mistake of walking up to the security booth, information booth, whatever it is, and asked them where the stills were. And they basically, I'm lucky I didn't spend the night in jail, I think, because they, told me that was a place of learning, and, how dare I, sully the place by coming in and, asking about whiskey. And this was probably 2011 or 12, so didn't actually become an accepted, and they embraced it for several years after that. Because the next time I went, I learned my lesson, and we just walked in like we knew what we were doing. And if you kind of act like you've been there, they don't bother you. And we just walked in and checked out the stills. But it's pretty cool because you can. So they basically built, the college around it. The stills are still there. They've been exposed to the elements all this time, so they've turned green in color. But it is, I can tell people, any of you that might be thinking of coming on the trip next May to Dublin that we're going to do, this will be a stop on the walking tour, day one. Kind of I consider it like Mecca. You got to kind of walk over and check out the old Johns Lane distillery, or at least the parts that are still there. So it's a little piece of history. And we won't bother the students. I don't think they mind, despite what the security guard wanted to tell me. So is anybody trying Johns Lane for the first time tonight?
First time, but I'm loving it.
I say, have we made anybody who's kind of new to ours? Have we converted you yet? We're not really a cult. We're not trying to convert people to anything or.
I'm new to you guys. I've only been with you guys for about a month now, so this is kind of awesome. This is my first.
We're
virtual
absolutely a Powers cult here.
But hey, I love Powers, so this is awesome.
Right, exactly. Holy cow! I had to go back to the shelf and pull out a 14-year from Friend in Hand in Belfast too.
Oh, nice. Oh, are you going to get the new one that just got released?
Maybe.
Yeah. So that's again. So the Johns Lane, everything moved down to Middleton. So this got shuttered along with everything else in Ireland, and they consolidated everything down in County Cork and Middleton. So that's really the last piece of anything that survived, because you've got the old Bow Street distillery for Jameson, that the property is still there and they do tours out of there. But most of the other big distilleries are gone, like DWD and Rowe, and so they've reopened some new ones, but the old distilleries are gone. So this is one of the few things left from Johns Lane, and you can see there's a little alleyway there as well, where you can see the sign for Johns Lane. The reference to the street, but it's like literally it is a lane as opposed to, say, a street. All right, so that's their core current range now: the Gold Label, the Three Swallows, and the Johns Lane. So we'll talk about some of the things that have been retired along the way. I think up front, a couple people were drinking Signature, so we'll talk about that in a moment. The other thing I wanted to talk about, and some of you I think I saw already have some, but one of the things that has been going on the last few years, they have done a bunch of single cask releases of Powers. So even though there hasn't been a lot of stuff happening, I would argue, here in the States with the brand, back in Ireland, it's still kind of the people in the know. So a lot of the pubs, have done single casks, or the stores like Celtic, and some of the others have done their own Powers cask releases and bottlings along the way. Because for a long time, people were clamoring, particularly when the cask strength craze really picked up steam the last few years. Everybody was saying, how come we can't get a Powers cask strength? Because the most you had was the 46% 12-year. So that was a big thing that everybody was looking for. And they've since, a couple pubs and stores have since done that.
Did they do a Johns Lane cask strength? I mean, I did a tasting like where it was a deconstruction and one of
Yeah.
them was cast strength. But did they ever bottle that, or was that for like the Jameson Club? Do you know?
There was a club one that did it. They've never done an official release out of Middleton,
Yeah.
but I'll jump ahead a little bit. So here's a cast strength from Palace Bar that just came out. So you can tell because it's the new labeling. So this is a single cask 16-year Palace Bar, and this is, I gotta see what the actual.
But that's not a John's Lane cast strength. That's a single cask one.
True, you're right.
Yeah.
You're,
Okay.
you're right. I'm sorry.
No.
Yeah, but
No.
this is 58.7%.
That's pretty awesome, though.
Yeah, so it's a cast strength Powers. Yeah, so technically you're right. A cast strength John's Lane has not been officially released, but they've done a couple deconstruction type things.
Yeah.
And little one-off kind of special stuff. But yeah, so that's kind of what's been happening over there. It's hard to get them. I mean, I got that cast strength bottle from Palace Bar, but and you can get them in the auctions and things like that. But so let's take a minute and just talk about kind of what's been happening lately with the brand. So we've seen different people have different bottles, and I've shown you a couple different iterations over the last 10 years even. So they did do a redesign a couple of years ago, which was somewhat controversial. So I'm going to let Carol kind of explain that a little bit, and then we can talk about it more.
So at the moment, what does the future hold for Powers? There's been a revamp in the last few years. The bottle has been redesigned, but it's being redesigned for the future, but with an eye on the history and the past. And the style at the top here, that is to reflect the pot stills that were in situ in John's Lane, that were designed in-house by the Powers family and their own distillers. It's to reflect that history and that continuity. And all through the history and through the archive, what came front and center, how the Powers refer to themselves, was with the Diamond P. So what we've done is we've put the Diamond P front and center, and you see it on all the new bottlings. And it's a vision for the future, but it's a nod to the past as well.
All right, so I'll open this up. We'll do a little informal vote. So that's the new design, and then the other two offerings have just a different color scheme, but basic same idea with the P front and center. So the prior version before this was this, which people generally liked. And when they switched to this new one, kind of met with, the squatter bottle, and they took, it was kind of met with, I don't know if it was overwhelmingly accepted. Come around to thinking based on the history, I like the new one better, because this old version didn't have the P, it was just kind of, they weren't really playing up to the things that the history of the brand and the legacy, I would argue. So I kind of like the more prominent P that they're using now, but that's my opinion. So I'm come, and I would say this is probably the exception. Most of the rebrands that have happened, like Green Spot, not a fan of the new bottling. Most new bottlings I don't like. I like the old. But this one, in this case with Powers, I actually like the new, because it's more, I think, like it was back, or back in the day. So that's my take. But I don't know what other people think.
Yeah. So my take as a marketer is that the new brand needs a lot of investment to tell the story behind it, because it obscures the differences and it obscures John Lane and some of the others. It's the P is up front. If you're not going to invest in the major brand, then you're making it harder to understand the sub brands. I love the new bottle because the bottle's different, but I would have liked to see some combination of the old with the new.
Yeah. Well, I like the two versions ago where the gold label was more prominent too, because this has the P in red, but doesn't have the gold label. So yeah, it's, I don't know, marketers.
I'm a marketer. I mean, I coach people on marketing.
I'm giving you a hard time.
Right, I know, but the main thing is it's really hard to see the differences between them. So like if you're trying to decide on a Powers, you don't know, is it a gold label? Is it a 3 swallow? You can't tell unless you understand the color palette that they chose.
My guess is that, and I'm not a marketing expert, they must have decided that the coloring was enough to distinguish, because like I would argue Bushmills did the same thing this year.
Yeah.
With the 10 and 12.
I don't like their new labels either, but
Right.
really there's a lot of verbiage all over the label, and what differentiates them is the color.
Yeah.
But
Alan, I do think the new branding for Powers, if they invest in the brand, it can work really effectively. But if they don't invest in the brand, then it's like, I don't know what to do.
Agreed. Yeah. And because nothing frustrates me more when I would travel within the state here in Massachusetts, and just, every once in a while I'll be somewhere and I'll say, I'm going to go into this liquor store and just see what they have.
Right.
And, if I'm in a town I'm not from or familiar with or whatever, and nothing frustrates me more when I walk in there, the first thing I'll look for is, do they carry Powers?
Right.
And if they don't have Powers on the shelf, it's kind of like, okay, they don't even carry Powers. What's going on? But that I've always found frustrating.
Right. But I also think there's an opportunity for Powers, like where it's again on the pot still, particularly with the 3 swallow, where if they like, I want to send someone into a pub, into a store and say, look for 3 swallow if you want to just try single pot still for the first time. And it'll be hard for them to find that.
I hope the new advertising campaign they're doing and the new distributor they have, and just, it seems like, there's a little bit of momentum now. The fact that Kathy, you said you saw the billboards. I haven't seen those yet, but that's great, because I've never seen anything in print or media for Powers around here. So that's great.
Because beyond the micro brands, if there's one brand that needs more promotion, it's Powers, because it's so good. Everything they do is so good. So that's all awesome.
Yep.
Yeah. So the only bad that could come out of it is if it becomes really popular, it might be harder to find. But I guess that'd be somewhat of a good problem to have. But so, with we're kind of talking about the future a little bit. One of the things I did want to also just touch on, kind of as we're talking here, is just some of the things that I think we alluded to a few of them, but that have been retired. So when they did the rebrand a few years ago and came out with the 3 Swallows and the John's Lane in between, they had the signature.
So good.
Yeah, which was in between.
It makes me cry.
Yeah, well,
Matt's probably crying too.
So the green, this one was the green bottle, green box.
I bought 5 when I heard they were dying.
Yeah. So I think what the problem with it was, it wasn't different enough, and it wasn't needed, I guess is how I would put it. So it was the same strength as the 3 Swallows.
Yeah.
And it was maybe a year or two different, in terms of falling in between. So it wasn't like that different.
Yeah, there's not enough separation between the 3 pot stills.
So
and
I
if
think
it's a messy middle is a messy middle.
Yeah. So they said the John's Lane is a huge success, age statement, and the 3 Swallows is that intro pot still, so we can get away with 2. And they retired it, and then that started the free-for-all, people trying to find them all in the shelves. And I don't think you'll find them anymore.
They're hard to find. I live about 30 miles north of Dallas, Texas. In order to get mine, I had to drive all the way to Roswell, New Mexico. And I got the last 2 bottles they had.
Nice.
Were there any? Were the aliens holding it for you there, or what?
I wish they had more bottles than just 2 then.
Yeah. I found 4 someplace like last year and I just bought them all.
Did you really still found them, huh? Interesting.
It was like a year ago though. It
They're
was
out
like a
there,
year
yeah,
ago.
they're out there
Okay.
here or there, but
Yeah.
got a stock going.
And
but-
then they don't realize it, right? Because like I was visiting my daughter when she was working in Chicago, and I walk in a pub and I walk in and like they have a signature. I'm like, I'll have that. Can I have the whole bottle? They're like, what?
Yeah, so that was, there's been a few, I'll use the word controversy. So, you had initially the retiring of the 12-year. So,
Yep.
So the 12-year came in this black tube, and I still have a bottle. This was a pleasant surprise, when you have a lot of bottles on your shelf, which I'm not showing you guys in the background, but I was doing kind of a reshuffling inventory about 1.5 years ago, kind of during COVID, and found, I'm like, holy crap, I still have a bottle of Powers.
So Alan, is that basically the same mash bill as Powers, where it's heavy pot still and a little bit of grain, but at 12-year for everything? Yeah, it's because it's awesome. Like, yeah, I was at Sky and Ground in Wexford.
Yeah.
Which if you ever go to Wexford, well, if you go to Wexford, have a car so you don't have to just stay in the town of Wexford, because there's not a lot going on. But if you can only stay in the town of Wexford, go to Sky and Ground and just stay there the whole night, because it's awesome. They have incredible whiskey.
Yeah, I've read about it and heard about it, but not had the pleasure of being there. But yeah, so I hadn't had the 12-year in a long time, since it basically got retired. And that bottle I found on my shelf, I haven't opened it yet, but they had it at the Temple Bar, little mini whiskey bar that they have there.
Yeah.
So I popped in there and for a minute and stayed when I saw they had it. Like, yeah, pour me one of those. So that was kind of controversial, but then I think John's Lane made everyone kind of forget or get over that pretty quickly.
Yeah.
And then when they did the whole pot still range, that was very popular. And then they retired the signature, so that would have been the next controversy. And then they did the rebrand. That would have probably been the latest. Controversy in quotes, it wasn't that end of the world or anything, but.
Yeah, I mean, the one comment I'd make on this is if you can find one of their single casks, whether it's 1821 or any of those, and look for them. They're not, most of them aren't crazy expensive. Some of them can get really crazy, but they are so good. Like a single cask Powers is so awesome.
So it's almost like I'm feeding you cue cards. So I poured this as we were kind of going. So this is the 16-year-old single cask from Celtic.
Yep.
And this is cask number 70142. So it's 46%, but to your point, so I think I got this last year for myself for Christmas.
Yeah. Just don't buy the Fox and Geese, because that costs you like 600 euro or whatever the hell it is.
Yeah, I'm a fan. I'm not crazy. I mean, I'd rather buy 4 bottles of, something else than one of that. But so that's a single cask, and then I have the single cask from Power. So those are the 2 single casks that I have.
Yeah, they have a few 10 years that are really nice that I think are more affordable if you do Irish whiskey auctions.
Yeah.
Some of the others are more expensive.
Yeah, the other one that I don't have that's pretty readily available if you go to Ireland, I saw it in a number of places, is the I think it's the 1817.
That is so, if you can find that, is so good.
Yeah,
I've gone through like 4 bottles of that.
You can get pours of that pretty readily in Dublin, at least. They did, so there's different versions in some of the bars, like a Belfast pub. The Friends,
I just poured the 1817. Literally just poured it.
Okay. So did you buy that while you were visiting there?
That's a good question, Alan. I think it's an Irish whiskey auctions one.
Okay.
I did get I had one of the 10-year singles from a trip, but this one I think was an IWA.
Okay. Yeah, it's always a good I don't know, I kind of consider it a good problem when like you have a bunch of whiskeys and you don't remember where you got them necessarily. That's kind of a good, I consider that a good problem to have, you know?
Honestly, on that auction anymore, I think the power stuff is about the only time you can really get a deal. The Redbreast stuff's just out of control on that.
Yeah, there's good and bad to everything, right? So it's kind of like Powers. I don't want it to become so popular that, you know, the prices get out of control. So you want it to just be popular. It's kind of like hockey, you know, you want it to be, you know, it's like a niche sport, niche whiskey. But because yeah, I mean, you know, like you see it with things like the Middleton Very Rare. You know, the prices just get crazy, and I would take a Powers over that any day of the week personally. But you know, particularly some of the prices that they pay for the Middleton Very Rare, which is a 40%, you know, blend, nice whiskey. But I think some of the Power stuff has got to beat. So that's kind of our run through. So the full interview with Carol is going to be, again, like I said, we'll put that out there ultimately, and that gives more background on the early days, how they formed the distillery, the working conditions, some of the other things that I mentioned, you know, how they became like the biggest brand in the world at the time. So, but it's about a 45-minute long video. So I gave you about a quarter of it tonight.
I got a question, Alan.
Mm-hmm.
Given Power's popularity at the turn of the 20th century, how much did Prohibition in the United States kill Powers? Did that have really anything to do with it, or was it just
yeah, oh yeah, it's the same as all the other brands and distilleries are. You know, it I don't know if it hurt them any more than others, but given that, you know, because they did have presence in the rest of the world much more so than other brands.
right?
You know, but the US obviously is a biggie, but it wasn't just Prohibition, it was the, you know, wars and other factors that killed it. And then you know, I think Carol alluded to it earlier, at the time it was a heavy pot still, and taste changed after the first war.
Yeah, she did, you're right. She did say that, and that's something I learned tonight. I was, you know, I'm thinking more of, hey, Prohibition just destroyed a lot of the Irish whiskey,
which it did,
business.
Yep, it definitely did. Well, there was a number of factors. You had a trade war with England, you know, so like they cut off the UK market, then the Prohibition cut off the US market. There were various wars along the way, so it made shipping very difficult to other countries, and you know, so, and then you had, you know, the column still invention, you know, and the blended whiskeys really took off, you know, so this heavy pot still kind of style also then started to fall out of favor. So there's a, you know, a whole host of reasons why, but yeah, Prohibition's in the top two because it cut off the market entirely. And that, you know, one of the things too with Powers at the time, I think it's in the full interview I did, they had no interest in, you know, cutting corners, skirting the rules, trying to, you know, do stuff, because the way they did things. So, but you know, to that end though, in 70, 71, whatever it was there, when they were down, they were one of the few that still were around. Jameson, you know, so while everyone else kind of faltered, they were able to still hang on. And when they did the consolidation, they were one of the big three.
Just one other thing, just to jump in there, Alan, and Matt, the historical context of the trade war with England back in, I believe it was the 1930s. It didn't just affect the sales of Irish whiskey into the UK. It actually ended all the export markets of the old empire. So Canada, Australia, South Africa, and another slew of countries in between. It cut all of that off. So, Alan says top two. I'm not sure which had the bigger impact, but certainly prohibition and that were basically the start of the nails in the coffin for Irish whiskey.
Oh, damn.
Yeah. And they had arguably more of a worldwide presence than a lot of the other brands. And they lost, so everything kind of got cut off. So that's why they called what's going on now just, the third or wave kind of where it's really coming back strong. So we'll see, because back 200 years ago, Irish whiskey had it all over Scotch.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. So if you've been on any tours, they, besides the triple versus double distilled thing, they let you know some of those kind of things.
Yeah,
They really didn't have the Irish whiskey resurgence until probably mid 80s.
Oh, keep going.
No,
Oh,
yeah,
really?
I was gonna say when we started in 2010, we were ahead of the game. The society, we were, we had a core group. We would do tastings in pubs, but yeah, Irish. There was 3 or 4 Irish whiskeys if you were lucky in a pub in 2012.
Yeah, that's about right. And it was either Bushmills, Jameson, or Tullamore Dew.
Yeah. So
Paddy and Paris.
Yeah, so it's and it's just taken a while, and now there's just a ton of stuff. But even to this day, it's still, there's kind of what I call the bar starter pack. When you go into some, you kind of can see you go in and they have, a Scotch, Jack Daniels being, like they have that starter pack of whiskeys and vodkas and stuff. So you kind of can tell right away if it's a whiskey bar or something like that. You can tell, when you go into a place and they've got a real cool selection stuff, you kind of found something when that happens.
Matt, I'd suggest if you have some time, Irish Distillers produced a really interesting short version series of podcasts.
Okay.
And the wonderful Carol Quinn is in a lot of it. I'm going to say they're kind of 8-minute to 15-minute episodes. A story of Irish whiskey, and she covers a lot of what you've been asking about in terms of like the rise and then the fall. Covers it really well.
Yeah, I think it's in the long interview too, but I didn't include it in this. I just did the kind of minute snippets. And
thank you, Andrew.
Yeah, well worth it.
Yeah, that's a really good series. I'm gonna guess, Andrew, it's probably 3 years old ish. Right?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, that was a really good one. That was actually one of the things that kind of got me interested in the real history of it. So yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I kind of fell in love with Carol's lilting voice through that podcast, and she speaks with such wonderful passion and authority. It's lovely to listen to her talk.
Well, one of the things that I didn't include it tonight, but it's in the beginning of the long interview, is how she talks about how she's a huge fan of Powers and it's her favorite whiskey and she doesn't hide it. And that whenever they do an Irish Distillers event, that's what she drinks and everybody knows it. And she's not supposed to be so public about it, but so it's kind of, so she's a fan as well as, it's kind of work and pleasure in this case for her in terms of the brand. But it's kind of cool. I mean, I guess I can't say this with absolute conviction, but it seems like while the other like Jameson and Bushmills are old, same era as Powers, they don't seem to share the same history in terms of some of the kind of unique things about it, or either that or they just don't have the archives to support it and tell the story like they do. So Jameson's had all the marketing clout, but I haven't heard anywhere near the kind of stories and history about the brand compared to what Powers has, for what it's worth. But all that said, it wouldn't matter much if the whiskey wasn't good. And, so, I mean, it might matter a little bit because marketing can carry something a long way, as we've seen with certain things. certain brands, but it's kind of weird that there are brands out there that have 10 times the popularity of Powers that aren't even half, aren't half the whiskey.
Proper 12.
So, so marketing should not be taken for granted, I guess, or having a namesake, ambassador or somebody to promote your brand. So, in a way, I don't want that because I don't want it to be looked at as it's popular just because of that. But there's got to be a balance in there somewhere. So hopefully they're on their way with this new campaign that they're doing. Has anyone seen the new ads that they're doing?
No.
Yeah, so they're in a lot of the social media stuff. They're on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. I've seen them. It's kind of trying to think. They have it's like an older generation of actors, and they're promoting the fact that it's an old historic brand.
Apparently, they're old Irish basketball players, according to.
Yeah,
I know Jay knows Kieran Quinn from a couple other groups, but Kieran, who's a buddy of mine, New Jersey guy, knows both of those guys. He played national basketball for Ireland and knows both of those guys.
Okay. Yeah. So in a way, it's interesting too, because it's that's not going to be well known here. You know what I mean? It's not like a recognizable for an American audience. So they're balancing out the two. They're not just trying to target an American audience, obviously, with that.
Yeah, they're probably trying to, right. It's like a double dip, you can send two messages, right? It's probably more recognizable to maybe not everybody in Ireland, but some, oh, that's so-and-so, or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But it's definitely the messaging, definitely the history and all that, I think is interesting. The bottlings, I'll tell you, when I saw pictures of the new bottlings, my first impression was horrible. It's like, oh, this is terrible. And because I'm a part of it, I'm a Powers guy, so it was like my reaction was very immediate. But in person, I think it's different. Like when I see them in person, I say, oh, okay, this is different. Okay, I like this. I like the John's Lane. But I will tell you that to this day, I refill old bottles that sits on my
Dude.
I like
it. This is the old. I actually have an older one that is a lead. Isn't open, but I will take the bottle and I will refill it because it sits on my shelf and under my Powers mirror, which is prominent. And so, but the other bottles I don't. I don't have an attachment to the John's Lane or the Three Swallow. They're maybe they're newer. But this and it's actually the 40% bottle.
Okay. Yeah.
So, but I just love that classic. I have a 1920s label, just the label, and it's very similar. It's that big, bold gold label. That drives me nuts. Is that the gold label isn't gold?
I know. Right.
Yeah.
So that's the one thing I wish they could have somehow figured out that as well. They could have. I don't know why they just didn't make it gold.
They missed it. But the other, I do like in person when I got the John's Lane and even the Three Swallow, I said, oh, okay. Oh, I like this. This is, I could go with this, but I haven't been that with the gold label. But the others, I'm like, okay. But you're right. I think it's, you pour in some more marketing to it. It'll hopefully take.
And you need to, right? Because even it was the #1 whiskey, but it's that generation is much older. So if they want to capture the millennials, they've got to kind of reintroduce it and put some in, because most young people, the next generation doesn't want to drink what their parents drank. It's kind of the way the saying goes, right? So if they want to, they need to capture the attention and interest of the younger drinking crowd. They're going to have to put some money into it and capture their attention somehow.
It's interesting to you talk generational. One of the things I've seen out here, our friends at Row & Co have an ambassador. She works the Sacramento and Bay Area pretty hard. and she has a colleague in either New York or New Jersey, and they are out all the time, schmoozing and doing cocktails, etc., at bars, hanging with the millennials. And I'm going to say that Row and Co. and Go Label, they're right at the same price, $29, $30, $31. So I think that's what it's going to take to continue to build a brand, is they're actually going to have to put boots on the ground and get guys and girls into bars and foster relationships with bartenders. That's because I think this is a great cocktail base, like we talked about earlier on.
Yeah, and they're similar because that's one of the big things that Roe did when they introduced that blend, higher ABV, but it was created by bartenders. That was how they developed that recipe and formula, because they wanted to have it be used by bartenders for cocktails. So, but it's funny because that's Diageo, and Middleton Pernod is behind Power. So you've got two of the biggest drink conglomerates in the world. So there's certainly enough of a budget there to get the ambassadors and the ad campaigns and things like that. I mean, they certainly have an advantage over any of the new distilleries.
Yeah, it's a great point.
But we'll see if they do it. Because up until very recently, I mean, anyone remember seeing a Powers ad? So it's just, you saw Jameson commercials and that's promoted, and even Bushmills and Tullamore Dew, those are the three that you see, but you never saw anything on Powers here. So, I mean, it's one thing when you're in Ireland, you can't miss it. You walk into any pub and, just look at the walls and they're all covered with Powers mirrors and signs and everything. So, but over here, you don't get that much at all. So, yeah.
For the, I think if I'm correct in saying this, the United States is the biggest consumer of Irish whiskey.
Mhm.
If that's the case, the lack of advertising is piss poor here.
Yeah, well, it's, arguably they had a strategy that's been successful, and that was to push Jameson and lift everybody else up. But you could argue, okay, mission accomplished, and now you need to show some love to some of the other stuff. They did, and I would argue they did it with Redbreast. Last few years they rebranded that. They're using the Robin prominently in their ads and on social media. So, I think maybe now they're circling back and they're going to revive Powers now. Maybe that's just the progression that they're going to go in. But we'll see. Because the Jameson pot still is an interesting development that kind of came out of left field a little bit, to see where that's going to fit in terms of how they promote that. But we'll see. So what, let me just informal, what would, if I said your favorite of the Powers range, either existing, retired, single, what are people's favorite of all the Powers?
Signature release.
Okay.
That is mine.
Anyone else?
I'd say John's Lane by a nose over the Signature.
I don't have any signature, so I'm with John's Lane.
All right.
I'm a John's Lane.
Yeah. So the signature stuff, what are you guys going to do when it runs out? Or are you just going to keep trying to locate it?
No, I mean, I already know I'm probably not going to find it again. So, again, signature by a nose over John's Lane. John's Lane, I love it. I mean, I'll take it over Redbreast 12, Green Spot.
I think I was in the Palace bar just this past weekend where I saw Signature, an open bottle Signature. I think it was there. I don't think it was Bose. I think it was Palace. So you can still find it in, pubs in Ireland, for what it's worth.
Yeah, I think it's.
Does anybody else do the Barrel Club? Did you get the John's Lane cast strength version?
No.
Oh, it was, I mean, it's incredible.
I need to, yeah, need to find that. Right. Yeah. Yeah. The John's Lane is the same. It's just, I love the signature, but it's a little bit of bug. And I think it's as I'm drinking it now, I think about, it's a vanilla, it's a, but there's that like, I don't know if it's like it's a fruit, it's an apricot or a peach, or that jumps out at me on it. And that's why I love it. You know, and there's all those other notes, but there's like that little slides in there with me. And then the old classic, you know, standard pack is good.
They'll probably do a re-release at some point as a one-off, you know, how everything old is new again, or whatever that saying is. So I wouldn't be surprised if, you know, 5-10 years, all of a sudden they do a signature special release or something just to commemorate, you know, because it'll capture, you know, there'll be enough people that'll remember it at that point and want to buy a bottle, things like that. So wouldn't surprise me if they do something like that. But okay. All right. Well, we've kind of run, it's 2 hours now. So anything else powers related that people have questions on or would like to share while we're together?
Well, I saw it was Powers a rye. Wasn't there a mention of a?
Oh yeah, thanks for bringing that up. I forgot to mention that. Yeah, so that was gonna. So that they got TT&B label approval, but that's about all. I know I didn't have time because I just got back from Ireland and I've been busy, but I haven't reached out to try to. I don't think they would give any information, to be honest with you. But that is going to be interesting because that arguably is a departure, right? So, but it's a good sign though, because they're doing something new, and arguably that's an American market thing to play off the rye. People that are
Bourbon's the only other one, right? That has the rye.
Yeah, but that's softer. I'm thinking if that's a softer rye. I do enjoy that one. Yeah, I'm guessing this is going to be a more robust one because they're going to play off the spice note of the Powers. I mean, I'm guessing now, but yeah, we'll see. And I don't know because it's hard to predict the timing when you see a label approval and when it'll hit the shelves. But I'm guessing St. Patrick's Day is probably what they're gonna, you know, that would be my guess. But
I took it as a
green label as well.
Yeah.
I took it as a good sign because the same, you worry, as we talked about, right? Are they fifth in the line or whatever they are? You know, even if good. If you're putting a new product line in, to me, that's a good sign, right?
Yeah, exactly. New product line. They're doing advertising. You know, so those are things that bode well. So I guess what we need now is for them to be successful with it, so that they continue, you know, because there's certainly a cult following, you know, which is why all these pubs and stores keep doing the single cask releases, because there's enough of demand for that. So now it's just a question of whether you get the mass appeal.
It's interesting, Alan. You know, we all saw the TTP approval of the green label, but even at a minimum aging, they've been planning this for a half dozen years probably at the least.
Yeah. It's funny. I don't really understand sometimes what they're doing down there with some of their releases. But you know, like the pot still from Jameson kind of seemed to come out of nowhere, but then like, you know, the Blue Spot, when they came out with that, I couldn't really understand the lack of availability of that. You know, it's a 7-year, it's not like an 18-year, and you have limited stock, you know, and it just seemed like the allocation on the Blue Spot was very small. I don't know how else to put it. But some of the other releases too, it just seems like, because if they're having trouble getting whiskey on the shelf here, you know, what does that say for the rest of, you know, because they're the big boys. So
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so I'll be curious, it'll be interesting to see how it plays out. But again, with the Powers brand, the rye, it's technically handled by a different distributor than the other Middleton products now. So
Okay.
I don't know if that's good or bad. Here in the States, it's tough, right? But I mean, they should be in every state.
Yeah.
But doesn't mean it'll come to every state, because like I've seen that with other brands, like the Writer's Tears brand, we don't get the single pot still or the ice wine here in Massachusetts, but I've seen so I think with
I don't get them in Texas either.
yeah, but we get like the cast strength and
Yes.
the double oak, so it's like,
Yes.
how can we get 3 of the brand of their offerings but not the 4th, so yeah, so it's interesting. But that's a whole nother virtual event to talk about the different rules amongst the states and the remnants of prohibition, and we're all still paying for it in one way or the other. But
sounds like a good topic. Let's do it.
Yeah. So we've got other stuff planned. I did bring back quite a bit of stuff from my latest trip, kind of with an eye towards next year for some virtual events. And we've got the launch of the ISIs that we talked about up front. So if you haven't voted yet, or I should say, if you haven't nominated yet, please do so. It only takes a couple minutes, and then we'll put together the final ballots, and those will go out in a few weeks. And we'll do kind of a big announcement, figure that out in early January with the winners, and then talk about that. But so that'll kind of cover the next couple months. And then we've got the trip coming up. So that we did in the newsletter that just went out last night too, the details on the trip are out there. So if any of you are thinking of that and have questions, want to reach out, please do so. But that should be a fun trip. That'll be a 5-dayer, Monday through Friday. I'm assuming people might go in early or stay later on the tail end, back end of the weekend. But we're going to go see, we'll get to sample our cask down in Powers Court, do a day down there. We've got some great pub stuff set up. Some other things, some free time for people to do other things. We'll do Whiskey Live at the end of the week. So a bunch of good events. It's all kind of laid out there in the itinerary. So, and then we'll see how it goes in the new year with, other things that come up. Because I don't know if you guys are paying attention, you're seeing how it seems like every day there's a new release, So this is the time of year, usually Whiskey Live would be next week. So they moved it up to May this year because of COVID. They missed the prior year, but normally it would be next week. And this is when everybody would bring their stuff to market.
Because of the holidays. They
Right
want
before Christmas.
Yeah. So you'd go over to Whiskey Live and everybody would be pouring their new release. So they're kind of doing it again. It's for the holidays. So yeah. So you've got a ton of new releases. So that'll kind of carry us through the holidays. And then, we'll see. The Whiskey Live will be May again this coming year. But hopefully with some of the new stuff coming too, it seems like there's been a little bit of a pickup in terms of people being able to get stuff into the States. So that bodes well for us to be able to do some more virtual tastings, because there'll be more availability of some stuff that we can get out to people. So, because this one obviously was a bring your own Powers to the mix. The last 2 we were able to get whiskey out to you. So, but there's limited availability of who has, miniatures or whiskey that they can distribute here to all the states. So that's kind of what we're up against a little bit when we're doing stuff. So,
but this is okay, Alan, and I thank you. I mean, this is great.
Well, good. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed it, and so we'll put this recording out there as well as the full interview with Carol in the coming weeks, and be in touch with the results of the nominations and stuff. And, we're going to be promoting that quite a bit over the next month or so. But on that note, I'll let you guys go, and we'll be in touch soon with kind of coming events, and watch for the videos. And everyone have
Happy Thanksgiving.
Happy Thanksgiving. So
Thanks.
Yes, sir.
safe travels, drink some powers with your turkey. All right.
Gotcha, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alan.